What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? Welcome back to another Tech Roundup with my friend and colleague, Dr. Ramsey Faragher. Remember that he is the real-life James Bond Q, according to Top Gear magazine. Ramsey, how are we doing this month?
Very well, thank you, Sam. How are you doing?
Yeah, can't complain. Can't complain. Yeah, it's been going okay. Anything new come up in your world this month?
Well, certainly there's lots of interesting nav issues and electronic warfare issues going on in Ukraine, of course,
Yeah.
is what we're talking about a bit today. So certainly lots of interesting things going on there that are in my sphere.
Yes, and we're going to get to those. So we're going to be talking about Starlink. We're going to be talking about Swift. We're going to be talking about drones. Lots of Ukraine, centric tech, and also some other elements of tech that we've seen this month. So, as sort of Ramsey tees up, a horrendous situation in Ukraine, which has completely dominated the news cycle as it should. I've got actually some friends and colleagues who are over there. Ramsey, I know some people who work in your sphere have been over there, so it's been kind of very real for us this conflict, as well as horrific for the people on the ground. Obviously, an incredible amount of restrictions have been placed on Russia, both formally through sanctions, through their kicking out from Swift, the payment network, and, for example, not allowing Russian planes into UK airspace, and also informally. So places like McDonald's pulling out, Disney, and other sanctions like this. So, Ramsey, you mentioned, first of all, when we were talking about potentially doing some of the tech angles for this, you mentioned that the UK or the Ukraine drones, have been having some relative success, which we might not have expected. What have you been seeing there as someone who deals in this sphere?
So certainly the thing that surprised a lot of people on this front is how slow the Russian advance has been compared to how much they had prepared for it, and the sheer size of the forces used and things like this. And there's some really interesting aspects around how technologically advanced they obviously are versus how some aspects of simple logistical challenges seem to have been causing them problems, and the logistics of fuel and food and the like for their ground troops. But one of the things that has clearly been an impact is that the Russians have not taken over complete control of the airspace, although they clearly tried to do that first. And Ukraine operates about 20 drones that it has bought from Turkey, and those drones have been clearly very successful in allowing Ukraine to prevent the advance of the Russian ground forces. And there's just some interesting aspects around. It's one of the first times we've seen these aspects of asymmetrical warfare, where you've got very small, very low cost drones being used to kind of hold back an entire, superpowers ground forces of tens of thousands of vehicles and hundreds of thousands of troops. And it's reflective of just how many facets there are to this conflict that I think we'll talk about today. There's cyber aspects, and there's these asymmetric aspects of some very low cost tech being able to hold back some very expensive platforms coming in.
I think you said these are small. They're unmanned. Obviously, they're very, very cheap. Low radar returns. Is that something that we're looking at? Why they're having such success?
Yeah, so these are drones that are remotely operated. They're unmanned. They're very cheap. They are about the size of a kind of a hatchback car, but with them long wings on them. The wings fold up, so they're easily stored and transported and moved. They are controlled out of basically a shipping container. There's literally a shipping container that can be moved to different locations, and that shipping container contains inside it the seats, the communications, the controls, the joystick to fly it, and these things can be remotely piloted from a variety of locations, and they can carry quite a small payload, but in effect, because they're low cost and small, they're not as big a impact, if any, are damaged and destroyed as the traditional very expensive fighter jet that contains a very expensive pilot, because traditionally it takes a long time and a lot of money to train pilots up to be at the standard that you'd use them on the front line. Whereas, of course, when a drone gets shot down, the pilot is fine in the shipping container a long way away from where the drone got shot down. And so they're managing to keep these drones operating and keep the advance quite slow. And yeah, because they're small and they're made of modern composite materials, and the design of the shape of the drones, they're designed to deflect radar from the ground upwards and not back down towards the ground. They're clearly working very well in the role that they're being used in at the moment.
And this idea of asymmetric warfare, because I'm not particularly familiar with it, but I guess it's similar to kind of what we saw in the Palestinian-Israel conflict a while back, isn't it? With kind of very low cost rockets being fired to kind of overwhelm the Iron Dome, this kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about? A very technologically advanced, well prepared enemy and very low cost budget, if you will, countermeasures.
Yeah, I mean the premise is things like a Molotov cocktail being used to, destroy a tank, right? You've basically used something that costs very, very little to take out something that costs a great deal, and it's those sorts of it's a classic thing of guerrilla warfare and urban fighting that actually the people on the ground can make some very low cost weapons that can actually be very effective in stopping the advance of the very expensive stuff. And a classic example is electronic warfare as well. You can have a very, very expensive platform that can be disabled by a $30 radio that's jamming its communication signals.
Or one that thinks aliens are coming from 5 miles up in the sky and dive bombing the sea. These kind of things potentially, as we talked about with Mick West.
So, yeah, slightly more expensive than the $30 jammers. You can spoof and make ghost platforms appear on radar screens that aren't really there. There is jamming and probably some spoofing going on by the Russians. We've seen this. So there's been two things in the news on it. Monitoring from space, we independently in the West have been able to see regions where jammers are being used to block GPS signals that the Russians are trying to jam Ukrainian GPS.
Interesting.
Or the Ukrainians using GPS. But also just the other day, I think it was Finland announced that they were having problems with their commercial airliners coming into land because of jamming. And they think that was spilling over from, Finland reported GPS disturbances in aircraft flying over Russians' Kaliningrad. This happened with Syria as well. We will see more and more examples of civilian aviation being impacted by this, not just by having to route around the war zone, but jamming from within the war zone, preventing commercial airliners from using GPS.
Very, very interesting. Lots and lots going on. One thing we did see was this idea that Russia has been removed from SWIFT. So this was described as the financial nuclear option, and the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU announced a joint statement late last Saturday that they would be removed, and they would be removing selected Russian banks from this Society for Worldwide Internet or Interbank Financial Communications Messaging System, which is a critical tool for internet banking. What exactly is going on here? What is SWIFT, and why is it so impactful to remove Russia from this service? First of all, what is it and who's running it?
So it's a very old now international agreed methodology of electronically transferring information for banking. And what I think the simplest analogy for what's happening here is if basically we turned around and said, do you know what, Russia, you're not allowed to use email anymore.
Yeah.
You've just got to communicate with letters now, just like the old days. It's the equivalent of that. You're basically saying you're not allowed to do the electronic means of transferring money around that the whole of the current modern banking system is built upon. Tough.
Or you're not allowed to use Apple products or something like that. So
Yeah,
it just
do it
causes
the old way now.
disturbance. Yeah.
So they'll be frantically trying to rig up their own versions of trying to get electronic transfers going without using the SWIFT protocols. So it is significant, and it was the first of many of these steps that have been taken to try to really seriously impact the Russian economy. And the news as of just today was that we could be about 1 week from Russia effectively defaulting and the country being bankrupt. So these sanctions are actually taking they are having the effect that's intended.
So when we talk about SWIFT, you're saying is these protocols that banks use to move money around and to communicate with one another. Who sort of, I mean, this may be a very naive technological question, but who sort of hosts that, or is it just some sort of protocol that talks between machines? How can you switch that off? Who has the switch to be able to do that?
It's a good, well, clearly not Russia. So it's a good question, but it must indeed be that the West are able to control their access to it. So I mean, it is the equivalent of basically Google saying like you can't have Google services anymore, we're turning them off, or Facebook doing it. So whoever is able to manage the people who are using Swift, it must be America or Swiss or something.
Well, apparently here it says created in Belgium in 1973. The organization runs its own financial messaging network. Somebody was trying to ring me, which provides secure, standardized communication services and software to banks. And apparently it transmits 42 million messages a day last year. So this is a huge thing. And as you said, they're desperately trying to sort of find a way around it. And apparently China runs its own system. This is this growing cross-border interbank payment system, a global payment messaging system that had about 80 financial institutions by the end of 2021. So they're trying to switch over, but I guess once you've been sort of using that for a long time, it's not exactly easy to just flip on a dime and everyone to start using a different protocol.
Yeah, it's certainly not an overnight fix to the problem of being locked out of using Swift, certainly.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's probably not as interesting as all the tech stuff, but this is really, as you said, having a massive impact on Russia, and we're going to have to see how that comes to play. Also, talking about more tech issues to do with this conflict, there's obviously issues with internet connections. So internet connections are obviously going to go down. They have been going down as the Russian attacks move forward, as the sort of the battle lines move forward and infrastructure comes under Russian control or is simply destroyed. What's going on with the internet in Ukraine? Have you had any view on this before we get into our friend Elon Musk, who has tried to help out?
Yeah, so certainly most internet is still provided today via undersea cables and optic fiber and the telecommunications network, all very ground-based infrastructure. And so as soon as you start marching across a country, you can start to either destroy or take control of the communications infrastructure and limit people's access to the internet. Now, it's against the Geneva Convention to do things like blow up public services like the mobile phone network. But there certainly has been issues with access to communications technologies in Russia, in the Ukraine during this conflict. And so Elon Musk has been providing Starlink ground stations. So they didn't have Starlink in Ukraine a few weeks ago. So they rushed through getting the licenses provided by the ITU, landing rights, I think is the terminology, so that the ground state, the equivalent of like the Wi-Fi access point part that you kind of connect up to your computer. These things basically look like a little upside down umbrella that you shove outside.
So it's really interesting actually, just to back up before we sort of go into the nuts and bolts of Starlink. So as you say, they didn't have this in Ukraine until recently, apparently Starlink has been working on getting these landing rights, sort of working with the Ukrainians to discuss, excuse me, how Starlink would work in their country. And then we had this interesting sort of Twitter exchange where the vice president or vice prime minister, excuse me, of Ukraine was messaging Elon Musk directly and saying, "Look, you're trying to colonize Mars. Russia is trying to occupy Ukraine. Can you get on with providing us with some Starlink satellites so we can essentially keep the government running and keep the internet up and running?" And Elon Musk, never one to miss out on the publicity, but also doing something very worthwhile in this case, so he gets credit. Sent these Starlink satellites, the landing boxes, out to Ukraine, and they arrived a couple of days later. So here they are on the back of a truck, and as you say, they're just sort of a computer-sized box.
They look like they're a satellite dish fundamentally. So they look like a big dinner plate, but you don't have to point them in exactly the right direction like you do for the TV satellite dish on the side of your house that's pointing at a geostationary satellite that's always at the same azimuth and elevation in the sky for your house. These things are what's called an electronically steered array. So they search for the satellites that are screaming across the sky. The Starlink satellites only take like tens of minutes to pass overhead. And so these things effectively are steering a little electronic version of like a mechanical satellite dish in order to communicate with the satellite. Yes, they are a internet from the sky type thing. The thing that Elon Musk quite quickly tweeted out again after providing all of these terminals was warning people to just be careful with how and when they use them, because as I mentioned at the top, there's a lot of electronic warfare going on in this theater, and it will be possible for aircraft and drones to detect that there are these satellite communication devices on the ground, and so there's a risk that the Russians would bomb these Starlink terminals, and so people will have to be careful as to when they're using them and how close they are to them when they're using them.
Yes, there's a very interesting thread that was put out by here is John Scott Railton, where he was saying these could potentially be monitored. They could be triangulated, and then the people obviously operating them could be targeted. So first of all, how would that work, and what sort of ways around that can you potentially think of?
Well, traditionally, the only people in the war zone that are using a portable satellite communications platform are the enemy, not the civilians. And so for decades there's been munitions designed to home in on radio transmissions directly, or you would use electronic warfare equipment to locate a source and then target it with either a artillery barrage or send a GPS guided munition to that location. And so simply this thing is emitting and receiving on a particular known frequency that's on the internet. As to what frequencies this system uses, and so you can set up directional antennas, tune to that frequency, wait, and when you start seeing bursts of that frequency being transmitted from a given location, you can use directional antennas to triangulate where it is. Nowadays, you just use the pass of a satellite, or you'd fly a drone over an area in order to triangulate down onto the source of the emissions. And so it's very straightforward. This is a bread and butter aspect of modern warfare, that you can locate the sources of enemy radio communications and then destroy them. And so, yeah, I haven't read this thread in particular, but I would suspect that what it's saying is true, and it's warning people to be careful about when they're using the radio transmitter part.
So it was interesting what you said. So down in the thread, as you say, usually the people who want to use this kind of technology that Starlink will be like, so just to make people aware of exactly what's going on, there's kind of a ground station that talks with the satellite and then essentially beams the internet back down to wherever you are. This person's not getting the message that I'm in a meeting, but there we are. So it beams it down to a station, and you need to be close to that station to essentially get the internet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, this thing will come with a cable that's just designed to like run into your house. So these things haven't been provided with 100 meters of cable, so that you can be a safe distance away from the antennas, and that's the issue. It's expecting that when people are using these, they're cabled up directly to them, but the risk is that they are going to basically be a magnet for munitions, because Russia will not be able to determine whether it's a civilian or a member of the Ukrainian armed forces using that satellite communication technology. And I suspect they'll be of the opinion that anybody using satellite communication technologies in that area is a military person, because traditionally that was the case. So it's great that it's being provided from the humanitarian aspect, but they do all have to be careful that they're painting a little bit of a target on themselves. So they need to be very aware of that.
And you have to be quite close to this thing, right? So I think they said in places like in Afghanistan, when they were using this kind of technology, they would try to have a station that relayed away. So if the station was attacked, the ground station was attacked, the people who were using the internet are far enough away from it. Obviously, that might not be so simple with these boxes. So you have to be careful about when you're going to use this technology.
Yeah, and using them on the move, basically, not actually using them at the place where you are staying would be the key thing. So always go to the thing would be to always go to a specific new location, use it for only a few minutes, and then move.
Yeah, makes sense. How much of an impact do you think these Starlink systems will have? Because obviously, it gets a lot of fanfare on Twitter, and Elon Musk, he's obviously a huge personality. How much actual on the ground impact do you think it's going to have? It seems like it would be something that potentially helps certain businesses, maybe certain utilities keep running, maybe the central government keep running. Doesn't seem like it maybe is much for the general public.
Well, I mean, the situation on the ground there is getting so dramatically worse every day that I think something like almost half of the country's population is evacuated now. Right? It's staggering. So while originally it might have been thinking about trying to maintain some continuity there, I would suspect that the most likely sensible use of it now is indeed purely for the government, the emergency services, rescue teams, and the defence force to communicate and access the internet and get information in and out. I struggle to see today, with the current state of the situation there, that people would be using this to kind of browse the internet at home in the evenings.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So sticking with the kind of internet angle, because on the other side of the fence, Russia has really begun to kind of isolate itself from the global internet. Essentially, it's kind of hiving off its own internet, if you will. What's going on here before I go into some of the notes that I've made?
The only bit I saw on this was the news a few days ago that Russia had informed all of its businesses and government bodies to ensure that their online presence was all routed through and dominated by a .ru hosting website. So .ru being a Russian website. And a few years back, Russia actually did do a kind of a test drive of turning off access to the proper global internet and just running Russia-only internet. And it looks like they're putting that plan in action such that it will be impossible inside Russia to access any website that isn't a .ru Russian website. And so this is the modern cyber digital equivalent of the Iron Curtain, that they would completely shut off all of their population from accessing any internet content that didn't originate in Russia.
So I guess the first question is, why are they doing this? So this is, I guess, an attempt to block the flow of information, control the narrative, during a conflict. As you say, it's got previous in this, and now it's essentially been turned into a kind of walled off digital state, as you say, which is akin to what we see in China or we see in Iran, which both tightly control the internet and censor foreign websites. Really goes against the idea that sort of internet is a tool for democracy and for opening up these authoritarian countries, right? So they really do take this seriously, this control of the internet. And indeed, I think in my notes I found that they've instituted a 15-year in prison law for quote unquote spreading misinformation about the war in Ukraine. So this is something they're taking very, very seriously, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what they cite as being the punishment for finding a way to access non.ru websites as well. Because, yeah, it'll be interesting to understand what their justification is going to be as to whether they'll state that any website at all that isn't a .ru website is misinformation and accessing it as a crime. I don't know. Because, I mean, they can trivially outlaw things like Starlink satellites. They can basically state that there is no license for satellite communications outside of the military. So they'll be able to control those sorts of aspects. And that would be the main easy way to bypass this. It's not simply a matter of like being inside Russia. You can just fire up a VPN and magically it'll all work. We're talking about them actually being able to prevent the flow of any of the information in and out of the country via the kind of backbone optic fiber.
So that's what I wanted to ask about, because obviously a lot of people use VPNs nowadays, virtual private networks. Who's sort of doing this blocking, and how are they doing it? Because it seems there's a mix of things going on, right? So some companies are just withdrawing their services from the country. So things like TikTok, like Netflix, have said that they're not going to operate in these countries. YouTube's in doubt. Apple, Samsung, Microsoft, they've pulled various pieces of technology and various systems from Russia. But also there seems to be a kind of, so that's kind of bottom up, but there also seems to be more of a kind of top down government crackdown. How is that being done, and how can they just control the internet essentially when people have things like VPNs?
So the actual kind of flow of information around the whole globe via the internet, while every single individual device has its little, like, tiny little connection, like all of the final leaves on a tree, that trunk of that tree, there's still fundamentally a very small number of very big fat pipes, if you like, that are kind of connecting countries to each other and connecting continents. So there's not thousands of different connections all flowing under the Atlantic Ocean between, like, our continent, Europa continent, and America, for example. There's a very small number of very precious undersea cables, and Russia basically can control the small number of fiber connections that go out of its country, feeding internet in and out. The ones they can't control would be things like people living on borders, and actually the mobile phone coverage from a bordering company leaking into their country. Like the equivalent of kind of standing on the White Cliffs of Dover and holding a phone up high in the air and getting a French mobile phone connection, right?
Yeah.
That is sort of the only real weak link, especially if they outlaw and can prevent satellite-based comms, but they have full control over the cabled infrastructure that they choose to maintain that comes in and out of the country. And they can ban and outlaw encryption. They can simply prevent the protocols that take place to set up a VPN, and simply deny the ability to use encrypted traffic.
And as you say, they've got previous for this. So I think it was in 2021. They said they were slowing down Twitter to try and force it to remove certain content. I think it was essentially anti-Russia content during some protests. They said it was to do with things like pornography and such, but it was quite obviously a kind of government crackdown on outside information or people getting these free sources of information. VPN demand has soared by 600% apparently in the country, but as you say, if the cables are being cut off, that might not necessarily help you too much.
Literally, the most extreme thing they could do is literally cut themselves off from the outside world and turn Russia into an intranet where they only have internally connected IP.
And this can tie back to the Swift stuff as well, because if you're using something like ExpressVPN, for example, and you now can't pay for it with Visa or Swift, then obviously that's going to be even harder as well. So it's not simply a case of you just get around it with a VPN. There's a lot of other things going on, and as you say, it's essentially a digital iron curtain. One thing that we saw, which was quite interesting, with their restrictions of the internet, is essentially a California professor says that he spotted the timing of the Russian invasion by looking at Google Maps hours before Putin announced the attack. So nowadays, in our modern connected world with a lot of real world sampling of digital data and a lot of real-time monitoring by various devices, there's a hell of a lot of information out there, isn't there? What was going on with this particular story?
Yes, this was very interesting and totally predictable, actually. This guy wouldn't have been finding this out by accident. He'll have known that this was a feature that was going to occur and was looking out for it. So it used to be the case that any kind of road traffic news that was being read out on the radio, or that you'd go look up about whether there were any traffic jams anywhere, would be derived entirely from traffic cameras and direct reporting of the information via cameras or kind of people stationed along motorways reporting the fact that there was a pile-up or whatever. But for decades now, one of the ways that we can determine how well traffic is flowing on the roads is that Google actually just have the live feed from their own users. So anyone who's actively using Google Maps to navigate, while they're on the mobile phone network, it's basically pinging back quietly in the background the fact that they're currently here and they're traveling at this speed. And when you get a holdup on a stretch of motorway, the traffic reporting on Google Maps will very quickly, within a few minutes, go red in that section. And that's you. The fact that you've now come to a halt on the M25, that message is going via your Google Maps to Google's infrastructure, and they can report to everyone that there's currently a backlog of slow traffic there like that. So it only takes a few minutes for knowledge as to how quickly things are moving around on the network to make it onto everybody's Google Maps image. And what was going on here is that the Russians were building up to invade. And so around the outskirts of Ukraine, there were all of these buildups of armored vehicles. And in those regions where there were lots of armored vehicles parked up and queued up and kind of all stored just outside Ukraine, it would have all been red on those roads for a long time, because nothing was moving quickly down those roads because it's full of tanks and armored troop carriers. And the roads inside the Ukraine were just empty and would have been marked as green, no traffic on them, or any traffic moving on them that's moving quickly. But when the invasion happened, and suddenly a column of armored vehicles accompanied by walking soldiers, literally rolled into the country and started driving through Ukraine. You've now got just soldiers with phones in their pockets, kind of giving the little backhaul messages to Google that they're now moving but very slowly on those roads, and that there's a lot of people moving slowly on those roads, and so that went to a red line that there was lots of slow moving phones on this road, and so the first kind of publicly accessible piece of information that the invasion had started would have been the appearance of a traffic jam on that road connecting the Ukraine to Belarus and Russia, which I'm guessing is what the story is about.
Yeah. It's fascinating though, isn't it? Because we have all this real-time monitoring, there actually is a hell of a lot of things that you can work out, even essentially sensitive military information, just because we have that real world monitoring device in our pocket at all times.
Yeah, it just shows that the aspects you showed just before of like a Ukrainian asking Elon Musk for help on Twitter, and him going, okay, fine, I'll send loads of stuff to you, and us all be able to just observe these diplomatic level kind of interactions between people. It's it's a very interesting time that we're living in.
Yeah, it's bizarre to see a war in such detail, and all the aspects sort of laid bare before you makes a lot of people have made a lot that the horrific things like this have happened before, but we haven't necessarily seen it in such horrendous detail because it's so close to home to us here in Europe. Another aspect of this, obviously, is the impact that this invasion has on scientific research and technology knocking on down the road. So OneWeb is now in problems, ExoMars as well, because we're not going to be having launches from Russian rockets. So what exactly is going on here?
Yeah, so for a long time, since the fact that the space shuttle was grounded, and America didn't keep up a kind of Apollo style launch capability of its own, a lot of Western use of space has actually been piggybacking on Soyuz and using Russian capabilities. So people going up and down to the International Space Station, OneWeb, the British low Earth orbit constellation satellite, a Starlink competitor, clearly had a big contract with Russia to launch all of its satellites, and that's now they're being pulled. ExoMars was the Martian rover I worked on, actually. So
I was going to say, I thought you might have a little bit of a thought on this, because I remember you mentioning when we chatted previously.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's an awful lot of terrible things going on, so I shouldn't moan about the fact that ExoMars is now late again. But exactly. It's another piece of this that was sort of familiar to me. But it's the kind of probably a bit of both. It's that we don't want to be paying Russia money for stuff at the moment. So some of this will be us saying we're going to cancel that and not do that and not use that launch capability. And of course, there is SpaceX, and Elon Musk will be happily taking up as many orders as he can. But some of it is as well going to be Russia pushing back a bit. So, Russia know that they are key to the International Space Station being maintained properly. And I believe Russia basically turned around and said, well, fine, we'll just let the International Space Station burn to the ground then. They fundamentally just said that they would allow the International Space Station to burn up in the atmosphere now. It's a problem that's really going much further beyond a war in one country.
Mm. And that's obviously a lot of things that are happening in your field with ExoMars, with OneWeb. In my field, CERN has decided to break political ties with Russia. I know some people are sort of on the fence about this, saying you shouldn't be isolating Russian scientists. They're not involved in the invasion and such, but it sets a very difficult message when you're for somewhere like CERN, which is all about peaceful collaboration, working for the good of humanity. It was founded in Switzerland after the war to get that sort of neutral ground and try and bring people together. When one of the partners is doing things like this, it doesn't jive well with that sort of ethos. So CERN has broken ties as well, and as you say, it just goes to show the horrific knock-ons for science and tech that this is going to have. Obviously, that's far less important than the loss of life, but the ramifications are far-reaching, as you say.
Yeah. Hopefully, all of these pressure points from all of these different directions will be what does prevent a more serious escalation in any other way, because obviously we're talking about one of the world's most well-equipped superpowers in terms of nuclear arsenal. So we have to try everything we possibly can to prevent escalation in that way and put pressure on in other ways.
Yeah, and I think that's being nicely done with some of these technological and scientific based pressure points, as you say. So I think that's a nice place to kind of leave the conflict around. Maybe we try and be a bit more positive in a couple of other aspects of science and tech. So one thing you made me aware of over the last month was DeepMind has trained an AI to control nuclear fusion. So we go from a horrific conflict to something that could potentially be a milestone in creating a future of clean energy with nuclear fusion. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on here? And I can jump in more on this because it's more in my wheelhouse of particle physics.
Yeah, definitely. So DeepMind, of course, are the company that was founded by Demis Hassabis, one of our friends from Cambridge. Sam did his undergrad at Queen's College, and is now an honorary fellow at Queen's, actually. DeepMind,
just bigging up your own college. I
promised them I'd drop it in. DeepMind have been pioneering kind of neural net 2.0 and all of the things that they're applying neural networks to, and reinforcement learning and all this other cool stuff. And yes, just a few months back, they were in the press for solving one of these huge ongoing challenges in biology, which is how proteins fold, and understanding all of that. So
they're also the world's greatest Go player, apparently. So
they started in computer games, and they've realised that science is an important place to have
so much more. So much cooler.
It'll be very interesting to see how many Nobel Prizes Demis does have in about 30 years' time. It'd be nice to see if he can clock up most of them. I'm not sure what I'll do about literature, but I think he might be on the way for medicine and physics with these two, for example. But so this was some cool stuff a few months back about protein folding and the impact that will have on medicine. But the fusion stuff is really very interesting because it's a very obvious, smart application of neural networks and what they're good at doing. So basically what you've got here is fusion is when we smack together very, very, very light elements like hydrogen, and you hit them very hard and they fuse and form heavier elements, helium next, for example, and they release energy. And this is how stars make their energy. We've never done nuclear fusion power stations because we can't contain it. Stars are contained by gravity, and we have to use magnetic fields instead. And that's incredibly difficult because you have to hold the plasma in a certain way, keep it all very tight, control the magnetic fields. And we've never been able to do it well. And we can only get the magnetic fields to hold the ball of plasma tight enough for like fractions of a second before it all dissipates and stuff.
So we get these beautiful pictures. So it just to make people aware. So in this picture, this is called a tokamak. It's like this kind of donut shaped instrument which has very, very strong magnetic fields. And here you can see the essentially burning plasma, which is kind of like the material of the sun. zooming around this circle held in place by these magnetic fields to stop it touching the walls and damaging the walls, and to keep the reaction going, essentially.
Yeah. So imagine I had a ball and a pencil.
You've got something. You've got some props.
Here's an apple, a pen, right? So the problem you're trying to solve is like trying to keep this apple balanced on this pen, right? Which is incredibly difficult to do, especially when I'm not left-handed.
Yeah.
And imagine that the way to keep this apple balanced on this pen was that I had 19 knobs on a wall in front of me, and I had to tweak all of these 19 knobs 1,000 times a second to keep setting them to some exact new unique setting that controlled the 19 different ways that this pen could be oriented to keep this apple balanced. That's kind of the equivalent of what's going on here. There are 19 coils that control the magnetic fields for the plasma that's being used for the fusion. And those coils need to be updated with a new little tweak to their voltage around 1,000 times a second in order to keep it all contained. And that's the challenge that we've always had. The fact that you've got 19 little tweaks to make 1,000 times a second each to hold it all together,
and they're all interdependent, because changing one changes all the others. So
yeah. But what I'm describing is bread and butter for a neural network. As long as you can simulate the problem accurately and then train the neural network, the equivalent of like millions of years of experiments and playing with it, because they use what's called reinforcement learning, which is basically you let the neural network try and play and learn, and you give it a score. And of course, the score is how long it managed to keep the plasma, contained and the fusion going this time around. And in the same way that in the past, they've trained neural networks to play video games and to play AlphaGo and to solve other problems. And people also use neural nets to drive cars. What you've got is that they built a simulator. They hooked it up to this reinforcement neural network learning mechanism. They let it play with trying to learn how to twiddle these 19 knobs 1,000 times a second in order to correctly control a plasma. It's a bit like balancing the pencil on the stick, right? That it watches what the plasma is doing at the moment, and it makes a correction, and it keeps going and going and going. And basically, the neural net has learned how to play this incredibly complicated game of twiddle these 19 knobs and keep the fusion going. And they've demonstrated that they can do it in simulation. And that's what this Nature paper is about. And
well, apparently they showed that they could do it in simulation, and then when they actually ran the thing in real life, it actually holds up. So
yeah, but I think they can only, I think the real life system that they can test on can only run for 3 seconds before it has to be shut down because it gets too hot.
Yeah.
So it'll be exciting when they actually get to play with one that has been designed to like run permanently and actually produce energy.
Yeah.
But certainly they ran it until they had to turn it off 3 seconds later. But in simulation, they've demonstrated that they can actually stabilize the plasmas. And I think the key thing was that they demonstrated that they could form them into different shapes. Yes. And that's a key aspect, that they could choose a shape of the plasma, and that was demonstrating that they had full control over the system.
So the really interesting thing about this is that the different configurations that you can try. If you had to do that in the machine, you it's a hell of a lot of change that you have to do, right? But if you can do it in simulation, and you can get this thing to run and stabilize, and you can try all these different configurations, as you say, you're getting millions of years of experimentation potentially, and a lot of these different configurations produce different amounts of energy, or they dissipate heat better, and the algorithm could even potentially find a new way of doing this that we haven't even thought of. That
exactly.
Optimizes
and the experimental way, I think, when they turn it off after 3 seconds because it's too hot, they have to wait at least 15 minutes or something for it to cool down enough. But the duty cycling is crazy, and of course in simulation there's no duty cycling, so you just don't need to simulate that bit. So they can do literally millions of years worth of experimentation and training, like overnight probably. I bet the way the modern computer is working on these sorts of things, I bet it was like trained at a weekend, but it was the equivalent of a million years of actual experimentation.
It's incredibly interesting. They said one of the, as well as the extension that you said about doing it for a longer time, um, they're not sure how it will hold up when they go to a larger machine. So this was on a small machine. I think it was the TCV tokamak in
Yeah,
Switzerland, I believe.
yeah,
And if they go to the a huge tokamak like Eater's coming on board, or Jet has been, would it still work? Obviously, you're going to have a much bigger system.
yeah,
I guess many more knobs to twiddle, many more coils, other things
yeah.
going on. But
They would definitely
the
they would
methodology
definitely
can
have to
probably be
train.
extended, and it could be
Yeah.
very, very useful.
They would have to redo all the training for sure. And this is one of the challenges of this field. It's a problem called transfer learning. So we as humans are very good at transfer learning. So um, you can get in someone else's car that's got a very slightly different layout. The gear stick might be in a slightly different place. That there might be some annoying, slightly different things about it, but you'll just drive and be fine. You'll try the car, but neural nets can't handle relatively minor changes compared to humans, and they just don't work properly at all. And so it'll have to be completely retrained, but at least it'll be easy to retrain it.
Very, very interesting. And as you say, the implications potentially of getting this are huge for clean energy, protein folding, now clean energy, best Go player in the world. It's really pulling its weight. Is this reinforcement learning?
Yeah, I'm surprised they haven't done the stock market yet, but maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe that's just Demis's retirement plan.
Climate, stock market. There's a few more things to go. Um, yeah, amazing stuff. I guess we should finish off with a few quick fire ones. So we mentioned sort of last month that this rocket was going to hit the moon. It hit the moon. Nobody seems to care. Was it?
I think some scientists are interested in it, aren't they? Isn't it like?
I mean,
Surely
they were vaguely.
someone will
But
write a paper on it. Someone will definitely write a paper on it.
somebody has to write a paper, but nobody still seems to know if it's Elon Musk's or it's China's, and obviously nobody wants to nobody wants to take responsibility for this because there's a huge issue with tons and tons of junk in space. We've had the Chinese rocket that slammed back down onto Senegal, then one into the Pacific, I believe.
Yeah.
So they're not accepting any blame. Elon doesn't want to accept any blame. So I'm not sure that we've actually pinned down who was to blame for this, but it was a relatively minor collision, small crater produced, and seems to have. That's about it.
Has anyone declared it to be a UFO,
No,
or is everyone happy that it came from us?
there must have been someone. Surely, it's probably on the what's the new thing that they're doing out of Harvard? It's probably on their schedule.
Oh, the Galileo? Is it called the
Galileo?
program?
Yeah, it's probably on, probably
Yeah.
on to look at.
Yeah.
The next one I saw, I guess it's technology, very, very old technology, but technology nonetheless. Apparently, Stonehenge was a solar calendar, according to research. Now, I said this to you when I saw this. Haven't we known this? I'm sure I've known this since I was a kid.
I'm pretty sure I read this in a book when I was like 5.
Yeah, and then when I learned about, learned how to be a scientist, I'm like, okay, sun fits in gap, regularly set out stones. Like, it must be something to do with periodicity. What makes sense to do with periodicity? Oh, the sun or the moon. So, I mean, this seemed fairly obvious, but I guess new research has kind of nailed down a little bit on this. And it says it's a calendar essentially based on a tropical solar year of 365.25 days. And ancient people broke up the months using these stones, and then they had 3 weeks of 10 days apparently. So I think more just nailing down on the exact specifics of how the calendar might have worked. And a beautiful picture here. You can just see the alignment that you get at the, I believe it's the summer and winter solstices. So if you hang around this thing long enough, it becomes pretty clear that you can get these solar alignments, and that it might have been a solar calendar. But yeah, the main point I took away from this was, I'm pretty sure I was told this as a kid, and
yeah, and I think, I mean, it's quite straightforward, of course, to study ancient sites and look at shadows and the light coming through different bits, and confirm whether it's behaving like an astronomical clock and so on. The key thing that people have to adjust for is that we have a precession in our orbit. So we're tilted on our axis and we're spinning, but that axis actually wobbles around. And that means that stars are not in exactly the same place nowadays that they were tens of thousands of years ago. So we have a pole star, which conveniently is very near the axis of rotation. So it looks like the whole of the sky's stars rotates around Polaris. But go back tens of thousands of years, and our axis had pointed somewhere slightly different in the sky, and Polaris would have drawn a much bigger circle. And go back long enough, and maybe a different star would have been the pole star. And so the thing they have to account for in these sorts of things, where they're trying to assess what ancient sites may or may not have been used for, was remember this aspect that the stars have actually been in different places and stuff like that.
What was the sky like? What was the sky like when they were looking at it? We can't just take today's measurements.
Yeah, and I think that can be useful for trying to date sites, because if you go with the assumption of, let's assume that they were trying to do something very specific and very clever to do with equinoxes and alignments of stars and stuff, then of course by winding back through time and accounting for all of the mutations and wobbles and precessions of our orbit, you might find that, okay, well, if this site had been built 23,500 years ago, then actually all of this stuff lines up beautifully. So maybe this thing was built 23,500 years ago. So
it's a very interesting way of dating it, rather than traditional things that we would think of, radiocarbon dating, or
desperately find a bit of wood and radiocarbon dating.
And stuff, a bit of wood that's buried nearby, and that's a very interesting implication. As you say, if you can get a good idea of what these things probably were for, you can get a very accurate date potentially, or at least a good window on the date. Yes.
This reminds me, did you see the bit of news a few days ago about how they are planning on scanning the Great Pyramid of Giza with
muons, was it?
Cosmic rays or muons or neutrinos?
Yeah, I've seen this before. This is really cool, actually, because obviously these muons, high energy muons, cosmic rays, go through most things. So you can get a scan of these things by looking at the differences in these muons. It's really, really cool. Awesome. So that's
they're trying to see if there's a hidden chamber in there that we've never found before. Exactly, by like X-raying it using cosmic rays from the universe instead of just digging holes everywhere, which is what I do.
Where all the alien ray guns and things are that we never. So that was Stonehenge. The last one I wanted to cover very briefly, because I know you have to run off in a couple of minutes, was Ernest Shackleton's lost ship. The Endurance has been found in the Antarctic. So for those of you who don't know who Ernest Shackleton was, he was an Antarctic explorer, and they found this ship after more than 100 years of it being buried under the ice. I think it's 3,000 meters down or something in the Weddell Sea. So very, very hard to get to. And the tech angle sort of on this is that they've had to send out this South African icebreaker, and they have to send down all of these kind of cold water submersibles to try and find this damn thing, because obviously as soon as it goes down, it's a wooden ship, it's getting buffeted around by the currents and such. So they've been surveying this area potentially where it could be. I even saw people making kind of new star maps of the old reports that Shackleton and others had made on their voyage to try and kind of narrow down this area. I don't know how they worked out, but they've been going over this region, and they have managed to find the ship under the ice. Really, really cool. One other technological aspect that comes to this is that they actually realized that in the satellite era, which stretches back to the 1970s, the ice was as thin as it ever has been. So obviously a callback to climate change, and having that satellite data and that tech has allowed them to get to a situation where they were like, this is the time now where we should go and look for this historic wreck.
Okay.
So that's kind of a cool on the tech side as well. I think there's a nice little if I just play this video very, very quickly, because I know you've got to go in a second. They have these lovely little,
and as
see if I can
inspiring as this one.
find these little submersibles that they send down. These sort of cold water submersibles. I'm sure they had a nice little. Where is it in this? Maybe I'm going over
I
it.
don't see a picture of one in the main body, actually. I'm on the same website as you at the moment.
In the main body, is there? So
Yeah,
if I go down, there's a. Here we go. There it is.
Yeah.
So these cold water submersibles, I guess there's no problem with the cold water. It probably works better. Although you'd imagine some things might freeze up if it had liquids and such in it, but I guess it doesn't. So, sent down these cold water submersibles. They surveyed this area, and they managed to find the ship in very, very good condition, because there's essentially no wood-eating parasites in the Weddell Sea. I don't know how much stuff there is in the Weddell Sea. I imagine not too much compared to if it had sunk in tropical waters or so. But yeah, very, very cool. Very, very nice piece of maritime history. They're not going to do anything with it, because I think it's basically been designated as a site of historical interest.
Everyone abandoned it, right? It wasn't lost in a hurry in a disaster. It was stuck, and they abandoned it and it sank. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is the sort of interesting story of Shackleton. So they're exploring the Antarctic. I don't know if this was when they were trying to get to the South Pole. My history on this is not great, but they got trapped in essentially an ice floe. The ship was holed as the kind of ice compacted it. They all abandoned ship, and Shackleton managed to get them back to safety. I think he had to go on a little raft across very kind of tempestuous seas to get help and come back and help these people. So very, very cool story. A lot of mythos and history around it. And they really, really wanted to find this ship. And from the satellite data, now was the time to go and do it. And they managed to do it. So is there anything that science and tech can't do, basically?
On your nets.
Exactly. So they should have. I wonder if they could have deep mined Endurance's position and then just gone straight there in 2 seconds. I don't know. We'll have to ask. You anything before we close up, Ramsey? Any other business? I know you've got to go in a minute. You were talking about an electric road or something. You were babbling on about very, very angrily a couple of days ago. What was?
Might cover that next time. Yeah, I saw someone's gonna try out a glorified version of filling a road with electric toothbrush charging coils, in effect, and have an incredibly expensive road that you drive over, and it recharges your car battery while you're driving over it, using the same sort of tech that charges your toothbrush. And so we should probably assess just how inefficient that is versus its expense next time we chat. You just reminded me in this piece about finding endurance. I came across something that was in the news a few weeks back about someone who has been analysing old radio data to try to figure out where MH370 might be, based on the interference that the aircraft would have caused of the global continuous shortwave radio telecommunications that's always going around. And people have actually started monitoring them in a manner that you can actually dig back through the data and see where aircraft disturbed the radio transmission. So it might be cool to dig into that and look at its plausibility next time we chat.
So that's another one for DeepMind as well. Maybe it can run over the old gravitational data and find Planet X as well, where we're at it. Who knows? Who knows what it can do? before it gets declared racist in a couple of weeks, probably, which is what seems to happen to most neural nets. But fascinating stuff. Really, really good, Ramsey, as ever. Lots and lots of interesting stuff going on. We will revisit a couple of those next month. I know you've got to rush off now, so I will bid you farewell. And until next month, buddy.
Cheers. Thank you, Sam. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much for stopping by. Bye now.